Good afternoon, Morgan, and welcome back to the channel. This week we rip apart the subframe and also apparently my trousers. The box of shame. So what have we got in here? Spare anti-roll bar end link. Yep. Not just one spare subframe bushing, but 4. The box of shame. So now that we've got rid of the box of shame, I want to tell you a little bit about this episode. Honestly, I have no idea how anybody repairs the bushings and the wishbones on a rear subframe when this thing is fitted. I had so much trouble just trying to replace everything with the subframe removed. But anyway, you'll see everything in this next episode. Enjoy. I'm going for a drink. So starting into the subframe, I wanted to spend a couple of days WD-40ing everything in sight because, as I mentioned before, I have no idea how anybody does this job with the subframe actually fitted to an E39. You can see just how difficult the access is, and so I thought, let's just spend a couple of days getting WD-40 into all the parts that I need to remove. So in this drawing, you can see these are the actual parts that we're going to remove. And on the subframe itself, these are the same parts. So there's the air spring, the dampers, the differential, the drive axle, the rear wishbones, the front wishbones, and the lower control arms. So first we're going to look at the shock absorbers, or the dampers, and we remove the top mounts. Ah, it seems to be a spanner ghost in my workshop. So moving on, just getting the top mounts off, that's not so difficult. Dampers just slide out. And again, just looking at the access you have when this is fitted to the car, I have no idea how anybody does this in situ. And then we have the anti-roll bar disconnected, and we'll deal with the mounts later. And moving on, we're now focused on the front control arm and the rear control arm on the upper side of the wishbones, the upper wishbones. And you can see them here on the actual subframe itself. And we're going back in time a little bit and removing the adjustment screws from the wishbones. And now moving on to the air springs. And these also, you can see here a little bit of aluminium corrosion. And it's just turned to dust, but luckily enough we seem to have rescued it in time. So moving on back onto the wishbones again, these screws that are holding the wishbones on are actually the adjustment screws for the toe and the alignment, but they were completely corroded into the actual wishbones themselves. So aluminium wishbones and steel screws, they just don't mix. Even with the impact gun, the screw was just completely welded to the bushing. And I'm contemplating here, what am I actually trying to do, imagining again how this would be done in situ. And I wanted to try my best to remove the screw as intact as possible, so the WD-40 obviously didn't seem to help here, but I even tried the ball joint separator to try and push the screw through the bushing, but I just wasn't getting anywhere and I started to get rather frustrated.
So I moved on to some other parts of the wishbone, the ball joint that connects the wishbone to the knuckle. Those screws seem to come off relatively easier, and I think because the ball joint is steel, the screw is steel, that seemed to work a bit better. But here you can see the bushing is just completely welded to the adjustment screw. So even if I hadn't replaced these wishbones, there was no way the rear alignment would ever be possible, in my opinion. There was just no movement there at all. So again, the outer screws, outer ball joint screws come off relatively easy. But here I want to demonstrate with the torque bar how the screw is just completely welded to the wishbone. That should be a free movement. So moving on to the rear upper wishbones, again the outer side relatively straightforward, and this time the inner screw came off quite easily. But you can see the ball joint is completely rotten. So I'm pretty happy that I've decided to replace these bushings. But on the other side, I had a lot more trouble. And again, you can see here I've tried a couple of things. And what I did was I ground 4 sides onto the inner ball joint screw, which is shown here, with the idea of grabbing it with the vice grips and then trying to turn the screw. And it did work a little bit. You can see it did move. But in the end, I just threw the towel in, and you know what? It's easier just to cut it off with the grinder. So I got a couple of thin cutting discs, but I had to be really careful here because all I wanted to do was cut the screw and not damage the aluminium surrounding the screw, because that's obviously a lot softer. But you can see here, seemed to have a good bit of success. The screw was sliced without actually damaging the aluminium. But there was just no chance of turning this thing by hand. So the last wishbone on the rear is now out, and both sides of the knuckle are in good shape, and we add to the pile of scrap building up. But I just couldn't get over how much time I spent on this bloody screw. Anyway, moving on. Now we're going to focus on removing the drive axles and the integral arms, which are shown here. Drive axles and then the integral arms. A bit of swing action. Again, the torque bar really helped me here. I didn't want to put too much stress. But some of the screws came off easily with the impact gun. But I didn't like to use the impact gun too much because these are aluminium parts. Again, the whole idea of this subframe is to lighten the curb weight of the car. The E39 has such a great suspension and driveline system, but if it's not treated right and it's not looked after, it can cause a lot of problems. And you'll see how I try to combat some of these issues for the next person that does this job. So just removing the 3 diff mounts. But to access the forward diff mount, I actually removed the left-hand side drive axle, and that gave me a bit better access to the screws on that side of the diff. And then once the last diff screw is removed, I start working on the next drive axle. And forgive my editing here, but I promise I did use the impact gun on all 6 screws. So loosening these screws also requires a little bit of being careful, because these screws are T-headed and they don't take kindly to too much torque. And finally, we have the subframe freed up. I'm going to bench press this thing. But surprisingly, it's aluminium, so it's quite light. So moving on now to the outside, we're going to look at the lower wishbone. And again, I keep referring to, you can see the comedy act that I didn't even know what to say here, but this screw just fought me and fought me. And again, this is another one of the adjustment screws to fix the alignment on the rear axle, and I just resorted to the grinder again. But I was so scared, I really took my time just to make sure I was only cutting the screw and the bolt and nothing else, because both of these parts that I'm cutting within or cutting between are aluminium, and I did not want to damage these because just aluminium is so soft. But I got through one side, and you can see here how thin the cut was. But looking in, you can see that inner bolt is just completely welded to the bushing. There's just no way that was turning, and the alignment in this car would never ever have happened without replacing these. So on the other side, I decided to use the hacksaw, the manual method, because I was just getting too nervous that the grinder was going to damage the aluminium. But as you can see, cut through, there's the cam adjustment screw. And finally, we get the lower control arm out. But you can see here, this screw and the bushing, they just, after 20 years of use, became one. I just wanted to show how many cuts I ended up making just to get this screw out. Removing the subframe was difficult enough, but it made life at this stage a lot easier. So now we're just left with a pile of parts and lay everything out. So we got the anti-roll bar, the springs, the integral arms, the lower wishbones, anti-roll bar links, rear upper wishbone, the damper screws, the dampers themselves, and various other bits and pieces. So moving on to now the differential, I decided that this thing, although functioning mechanically, just looked terrible. So I pulled it out of the way, and I wanted to compare my nice new box of shiny bits to make sure that I actually bought everything.
Hello! Hey bro! I'm just telling you that, I'm filming this. So I don't know how it's gonna look.
So like I said before, the differential was mechanically okay. And here's my friend Robert on video chat, because of this was during the lockdown in Germany, and couldn't meet anybody socially.
This might take a few minutes.
So I decided, although the diff was mechanically okay, to order a new replacement, well, second-hand replacement I should say. And when it arrived, I wanted to do an unwrapping with Robert, just to see if we'd made a good call. So moving back to these dreaded upper wishbone links, I just decided I was cutting them with the grinder, and at this stage I had a bit of practice. So I took my time, and I was able to cut the screw on both sides of the damper mount. Both sides of the wishbone mount, and you can see again these adjustment screws. They're supposed to be completely free within these bushings, but I had to cut either side of the bushing to get them out. So moving on to the last wishbone, and as before, completely welded to the bushing. And again, I don't know how anybody would have done this with the subframe in situ, but luckily for me, with a bit of practice, I was able to remove the bolt with the grinder and not damage the aluminium on the subframe. So here's the last piece of scrap to add to the growing pile. And sorry kids, there's no barbecue this week. So just making sure basically everything has been removed, and anything I need to keep is going to be put aside, and everything else is going to get replaced. So the last piece of the subframe is the exhaust mount, and now the subframe's set up for a bit of soda blasting, which you can see is in partial process here. And then finally we have the subframe all cleaned up. So tune in next time when we go through the cleaning process of the aluminium parts. And here's a short before and after to give you an idea of what's involved in the next episode. So thanks for watching, and see you next time.